DSouza. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
All right, not bad. Securing Active Directory and PAM for ADDS.
Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate you all coming out here on a Saturday, and thank you to BSidesConnect for having me. And today I wanted to talk to you about securing Active Directory and Privileged Access Manager for Active Directory domain services. There have been some amazing presentations today, and I'm excited to be able to talk to you about this particular one. So a little intro about me. My name is Rohit DeSouza. I am a systems engineer for a company called Wayfair. They're based out of Boston. And a lot of my day-to-day tasks involve working with Active Directory. Majority of it involves hardening servers as well as permissioning, making sure that the permissions are applied correctly, and a lot of the server backend and infrastructure environment. When I first started out, security wasn't a big thing. I've been doing Active Directory work and other infrastructure-related things for about 10 plus years now. And before, everything was just copy over somebody's permissions, just, make everybody a domain admin, right? That was the go-to of, I can't do this. Oh, sure. Let's make him a domain admin. And magically everything worked. But now as security has become a forefront of how companies and are deploying production level applications, you have to stop and think about who you're giving access to. A lot of new IT professionals coming into the environment, you don't learn any of this in college. I definitely didn't. You only learn about how to create new user accounts and just make sure everything works, and then half of it you never even apply in a production environment. So when you come in and something doesn't work right, all you're concerned about is making sure that that person is no longer upset that something isn't working right. So you go in, give them local admin or domain admin, and yeah, everything is good. Not the way to go. Not anymore. And especially now that data breaches have changed from, the early days, from the early 2000s. Before, it was all about financial reasons, right? Everybody was doing it to get money or to steal bank information accounts, which is still a thing. But now, data breaches are all about identity. A couple of years ago, there was a popular one from, I can't remember the name of the company, but they hacked the Ashley Madison website. And they threatened to publish all the usernames, all the emails, and everybody was freaking out. And it had nothing to do with money. It would have had everything to do with, a lot of people were freaking out about they didn't want to get caught if their names were displayed on that website. And as things have changed, you realize that some of the things still stay the same. A lot of the focus on hardening environments is all focused on the outside, right? It's like we want to prevent this hacker from coming in to our network. But a lot of the issues happen internally when the passwords aren't set, when you don't have fine-grained password policies, when users set password as password, and you don't have a policy to change the password every 90 days. There's some organizations that never change passwords or service account passwords and things like that. So we'll go over a couple of things that everybody should be doing in their environment. So we'll go over things like the common best practices, such as access control lists for OUs. We'll talk about how to do group delegation. We'll look at a couple of examples of what the permissions look like when you have different access levels delegated to different users. We'll also go over protected groups. This is a feature that was released in 2012, and they've continued to make some improvements on Server 2016. And then we'll look at group managed service accounts and look at how you can provision those and where you can apply them. And then we'll go into something called Privileged Access Manager, which is a new feature in Server 2016 and helps to eliminate vulnerabilities such as pass the hash, as well as other known issues that can, allow hackers to go into your environment. We'll look at some of the requirements, as well as we'll look at the pros and cons of the lift it requires in order to be able to implement that, as well as other features to make it a streamlined process to grant users privileged access in your environment. So Active Directory has been around for a while, right? It's been around, and every iteration of it has new features and new changes to it that helps the systems admin make better decisions in terms of how to secure the environment. In 2008, you had things like Admin Center. You had the PowerShell module come out. You also had the recycle bin enabled as a new feature where if you deleted stuff, you could go back in and retrieve them. Then in 2012, they made a few changes, dynamic access control, and they also made promoting domain controllers a lot easier and more of a seamless process than it used to be. 2016 rolled around, and all the focus was about security. Everything was about how do we make this more secure? How do we do things to harden the environment that we haven't done before? They came out with shielded VMs if you had Hyper-V. They also introduced Privileged Access Manager, as well as made a few other changes to make the environment safer. And the one thing is, no matter how safe you make it, you can have all the technology, you can have all the tools, but if you don't implement any of that, none of that is really going to help you out, right? It's great to have all these tools in the toolbox, but if you're never going to use it, it's still just as vulnerable as it is before. And we're all very quick to be like, well, it's just the tool, it's just the application. There's nothing we can do about that. So we'll look at things like the three main Active Directory admin roles. Like I was saying earlier, when a user or a service desk engineer comes to you and says, hey, we can't do this, or we are not able to install this application, you're not sitting there looking at the logs, you're not looking at where it's trying to write, you're not looking at any of the key critical components to be able to grant that user specific access just for that one application, right? You're looking at, let's just get this done, let's close out this ticket, we'll make them a local admin, or worst case scenario, you make them a domain admin if they're an engineer, and then voila, everything works. And not the way you want to be able to run your environment, because let's face it, as humans, we make a change and we always say we'll go back and fix it later on. We'll go back and remove that permission. We never ever do. Even with GPOs and things like that, there's still that one-off where we'll have a change, we'll make a change to permission levels, and then you'll just say, yeah, I'll get to it later. Later never happens. You've got sevs, you've got outages. That person has been in there for months, maybe even years if they're still with the company. So the highest level of access in an AD environment is the enterprise admin. They've got access to the entire forest. And the forest is what the security boundaries defined as in Microsoft. It's not the domain, as you can have multiple domains in the forest. So just by a quick show of hands, how many of you have or currently manage Active Directory in your current work? Okay, good. And how many of you are using 2012 functional forest and domain level functions in your environment? Okay, 2008? 2003? Oh, thank goodness. Okay, that's a lot better than what I was expecting. And how many of you are using 2016 level features? Okay, cool. So there's a lot of features that we are not leveraging in order to be able to secure our Active Directory environment from within. We're very focused on outside attacks coming in, and none of us are ever really looking at our own internal configurations of who's got access, who doesn't have access, and why they need that access, right? So you've got enterprise admins who are the most powerful admins in that environment. They can make changes to, they can make changes to the force, which can or cannot be a good thing depending on the level of experience of that engineer. Then you've also got schema admins. Schema admins can make changes to Active Directory schemas, and depending on, again, the level of experience and how much of a risk you want to take, that may be a good or bad thing. And the most common access that everybody has is domain admins. How many of you, by a show of hands, know the exact number of domain admins in your environment? Okay. It's a lot lower than I wanted to hear. Nobody should have permanent domain admin access in your environment. There are plenty of rules. There are plenty of access controls and policies you can put in place to where domain admin access should be a very, very rare need in order to be able to do what you have to do. Typically, that number should be 0 unless they're doing something that's high, that requires that level of access. And even then, after their work is done, they don't need to be domain admins anymore. So we'll look at a couple of things as in terms of how you can not eliminate, but you can reduce the risk of who's got access into your environment to be able to change permissions, to be able to create user accounts, to delete user accounts, modify them, as well as look at things like group managed service accounts. Does anybody use that in your current production environment at the moment? And what about protected users? Does anybody use that feature in their environment? Okay. So these are a few key things that you can definitely use in your environment that will help harden the environment, but not really affect the user access in terms of what they need to do. So let's look at the Active Directory. Let's look at the OU delegations and ACLs, right? So I've got a lab set up here where I've got a domain controller and I've got a workstation. Does anybody restrict the user access to the domain controller? Okay, good. Nobody should be logging onto the domain controller. If possible, all of you guys should be using, and girls, should be using server core as your domain controllers. You want to reduce the attack vector, and you want to make sure that at any time they need to access ADUC or anything related to Active Directory Trust and Management, it's all done through RSAT tools. You can install RSAT tools on workstations or servers that you restrict who has access to it. So that's another way that you can reduce the number of users that you have that can potentially make changes to the environment that can have a detrimental effect to it. So let me log in real quick. And don't ever do this. So as you can see, for those of you that that can call it out quickly, I'm a basketball junkie, and I have my domain environment replicating the National Basketball League. And that's how I have it set up. And one of the things that I want to show you in terms of OU delegations is there's two ways you can restrict access to a environment, to specific OUs, right? Say that a lot of times the engineers will just go into the root of the directory and go into delegate control and then give them all the access that they need to. But if you dig a little further in, which we'll do it here, you can really, really restrict what that engineer has access to, right? So you can either use any of the preset customized setups that you can do, which is manage user accounts, join machines to domain, reset all user information, create, delete, and manage groups, or you can really go in and customize the access level either by the end user or by security groups. Now, if you drill down into the objects in the following folder, you can see how granular this can really get. You can have access where users can only modify the DNS zones and nothing else. You can have access where all they do is reset passwords. And depending on the tier of what Microsoft deems them in, tier 0, 1, or 2, they don't really need all this access to be able to move OUs or accidentally delete objects. How many of you have moved OUs, unchecked the protect from accidental deletion checkbox, and never remembered to put it back in there? And then next thing you know, somebody went in and deleted that OU, and you've got like 500 users missing from Active Directory. That can be a huge, huge problem when you don't have the right controls in place to where you don't know who's got what access. And sometimes you can have so much turnover where if the right settings are not set in place, it can cause a major disruption to the business, and then you end up losing a lot of money from the business side. One of the other things is that it's easy to implement these settings in a greenfield environment. You've got a clean slate. You don't have anything wonky or anything funky that you don't know of that has potential, that can have potential negative issues in there. In a brownfield environment, it's a lot more different because of the fact that you don't know what you don't know, right? You don't know what nested groups are where, what user has access to what, and then you're wondering when you do a screen test, you're wondering why these settings are even in place and are even there in the first place. So that's one way to restrict who's got access. So the other way to do it is if you right-click on it and go to the Properties folder, you can go into the Security tab, if this decides to show up today, and you can delegate permissions from there, right? Personally, I like doing it as the delegation of the OU wizard because I think it's got a lot of common features in there that you can really leverage for your environment, and it's easier to apply those to other environments and groups. If you should be all using groups also. So if you edit the permissions, you can set the granularity on this a lot more because you can decide whether you want this to go on the child objects, just that specific folder, and what other features you want going into that access. So here's a setting for a deny permission for this everyone group, and you can see how granular this can get. It can get very, very hairy very quickly because of the fact that you can really restrict all these permissions, right? But that's what we want. I know it's a little bit of more work than just making everybody a domain admin and moving on with your day. But in the long run, this hardens the environment from the inside rather than waiting for a breach to happen and then having everybody question why this hacker was able to get in, whose password was used, and kind of have a reactive situation rather than making all these changes and being proactive ahead of getting breached. So one of the things that I want to show you was, as a domain admin, here's all the features you've got, right? So you right-click on an OU and you do new, right? So you can do all these things. You can create a new computer object. You can create a new group. You can create a new shadow principal container, which we'll go into that a little later on as to why that's important. But when you restrict access the right way, here's what the end user would see if they right-click and make any modifications. So if you wanted to do, this user doesn't even have access to be able to create any new objects. All they can do is find and delegate control, which even that is restricted. So if you have a level 1 service desk where all you want them to do is just be able to reset user passwords and accounts, that's the kind of access where you want them to have. You don't want them to be able to create a backdoor somehow without you knowing. You also, you can see that the only permissions here are tied into managing the end user rather than being able to modify anything from the OU structure or the Active Directory structure. And let's look at another user permission. Also, don't use Oracle's cloud solution. It's terrible. So here I am logged in as me, right? And I've granted myself a little bit more permissions than service desk tier. So here I am able to create a new group, create new users, and modify permissions as I need to be able to do so. Now you can do a mix and match of both. You can do this setting as well as the other user, but you definitely don't want them to have domain admin permissions. You can see, again, what features I have enabled for me, as well as what features the domain admin has, right? They can do all these different things, and we are very quick to grant Tier 1 Service Desk domain admin access to make changes, and you definitely don't want to do that. Now, let's talk about managed service accounts. How many of you have been through this scenario before? Where that's not it. An application breaks, and all of a sudden you have no idea what it is. You're looking everywhere. You're looking at permissions. You're looking at the application itself, and eventually, when you do get to the logs, which is going to be about 30 minutes later because you're not looking at logs the first time around, you realize that the service account is expired. And nobody knows what the new password is or what the old password was in the first place. That's... So, one of the new and this is not even a new feature. This has been a feature that's been around since about 2008, where Microsoft created something called managed service accounts, where Active Directory handles the password storage as well as creation and renewal by itself. When they first rolled it out in 2008, one of the caveats was that you wouldn't be able to use that same account on multiple hosts. Each host had to have its own specific user account. And if you had an IIS farm or a load balancer from Windows, which also don't do that, you had to create a new service account each and every single time. With 2012 and 2016, they rolled out something called group managed service accounts. And they made it very simple to be able to create, provision these accounts, and then be able to use them in your environment where you no longer ever have to worry about how secure the password is, when the password is going to expire, and who's responsible for managing that account information if and when you have settings where the password is set to expire every 90 days, a year, or hopefully you never have password never set to expire in your environment. So let's take a look at how you can provision an account and then where you can go ahead and use it. So I've already done this example, and there's three things you need, right? You have to be able to, in order for this to work, you have to create a root key in Active Directory so that it encrypts the password and then make sure that it manages that at whatever encryption level you set at. So the first thing you can do is the add KDS root key, and there's two variations of that. You can do either effective immediately, but if you have a environment, a production environment where you've got multiple domain controllers, which is the best way to go, you want to make sure that this root key replicates to all those domain controllers. So you can set a time limit. By default, Microsoft says 10 hours. Personally, I think that's a little long because we don't really have that many issues in terms of replication and having to worry about when domain controllers replicate and when they don't. When they do and when they don't. So the second command is pretty straightforward too. It's just a new AD service account. You have to set the name for it. You have to set the DNS host name. And this is the kicker. The principal's allowed to retrieve the managed password, right? This is where you determine if you've got an IIS farm. Ideally, you'd have all the IIS servers in a specific group. And you only want to make sure that that specific group is able to retrieve the password from the Active Directory database. And the Kerberos encryption type, you can set it if you want to, but by default, it's set to 128. But if you really want to make sure it's secure, you can enable the 256 AES option. Now, when I first did this, I was like, oh, great, I'm done. I'm all good, I'm all set. And so I went ahead and tried to use that account on the server. Didn't work. It says cannot retrieve the password. And I was like wondering why. So the last piece to this is you have to explicitly set the AD service account to be used by the individual nodes. You have to be able to, and once you do that, you no longer, it'll allow it, you have to allow it log on as a service permission, as well as make sure that it runs for that specific environment. In 2016, if you look into the specific OU, there's a managed service account OU, and you'll see all of these accounts that you've generated stored in there automatically. So here is where I have it running on my local machine. Typically, you want to do this for a shared environment or a clustered environment of any sort, whether it's IIS, whether it's load balancer. Now, depending on third-party applications, some of them may not be compatible with that, so you have to be cognizant of what applications will support a group managed service account and which ones don't. So I ended up setting this account on the Windows Audio service, and that you don't have to set a password for it. It automatically will pull the password in from Active Directory, and you don't have to worry about when it's going to expire, what's going to break, and who's responsible for setting the new password or remembering the old one. So the last thing that I want to talk about new features you can enroll is something called protected users. It's a new OU in 2012 that they further made some changes in 2016. And one of the things that does is you want to make sure that you only put the most leveraged account, the highest privileged accounts in that specific group. And there's a reason why. So ntlm is still a protocol that's used in the Microsoft environment. It's not recommended, but they still support it. And when you're doing connections to a machine that's on a work group, it still uses ntlm. You can force Kerberos, which is what Active Directory uses, but you have to be very careful about setting that in your environment, because if you don't have service principal names configured, the Kerberos authentication won't work. And if you don't have ntlm as a default, you're going to have a lot of issues trying to access domain resources. So you want to remove using ntlm as an option, but you have to do so very, very diligently. You have to make sure that you set service principal names for all your applications. And until you do that, right, here's what happens when you log in with a normal user account that is not in the protected OU, that's not in the protected users group. So by default, when you're using ntlm authentication and you share and you do the exchange, your username and password is typically hashed. But that hash is stored in 3 places where it can be easily retrieved. In the service account manager database, in the local security authority subsystem, as well as the Active Directory database. Now, the problem with that is that key can easily be used. So you no longer need the username and the password. You can just use the hash key in order to be able to intercept a connection or set a malicious connection. For some of you that know about this tool, there's a tool called Mimikatz, where you can use it to kind of trace connections and also be able to filter traffic. So if you look at the first picture on the top left, right, when you have ntlm set up, what happens is that it stores the key visibly. You can actually see what the exact hash key is. When you don't, when it's in the protected users group, it doesn't remember that because it doesn't store the hash in memory and it doesn't store the hash in the System32 database because it doesn't use ntlm. It forces it to use Kerberos every time you try to log into a system. So that's one of the things that you only want to leverage this for the higher privileged accounts, right? Like Mary Jo from accounting doesn't need to have her account in the protected users group, but an enterprise admin, a domain admin, and even a schema admin, those are the kinds of groups you want to be putting in the protected OU, in the protected users OU, so that their credentials aren't easily traced, or you can't retrieve it from one of those 3 locations where they're typically stored. Now, everything I've told you so far is piecemeal. It's a little bit here, it's a little bit there, it's kind of tweak this, kind of tweak that. And Microsoft heard that, and Microsoft is notoriously slow at coming up with solutions for enterprise level systems, right? There's plenty of third-party applications that do this, but in 2016, Microsoft released a new feature. It's an optional feature in Server 2016 called Privileged Access Manager. Privileged Access Manager is exactly what it says. It's for the privileged accounts that are in your domain and being able to restrict what they can use and what they can and how long they can use it. That's the biggest kicker with Privileged Access Manager. It's a time-based group membership feature where you can set how long a particular user needs to have admin level rights for whatever they're working on. So Microsoft has 3 different tiers of where they see all their users, right? So you've got tier 2, which is your everyday users. That's your everyday workstations. That's the users from finance. That's the users from HR or any of the everyday users that log onto your systems. Then you've got the tier 1 systems. Tier 1 is systems admins. They're not really enterprise admins, but if they need to modify group permissions or if they need to modify user accounts and things like that, they would fit under tier 1. Then you've got tier 0. That's the one all the hackers are looking for. And it's not very difficult to get to the tier 1 credentials, right? Because if a hacker gets into Billy Bob's PC who's got his password set to password, right? He doesn't have local admin access, but he'll put in a ticket to service desk, and service desk will come by and be like, oh, yeah, we'll use, the service desk engineer has elevated permissions, so he'll put in his credentials, and guess what? We're still using ntlm. So his credentials are stored somewhere in one of those 3 databases that the hacker can now retrieve from there without even needing the password. It can just use the hash that's stored there and then move on up to the next tier, right? And now if you don't know who's a domain admin, you don't know who's an enterprise admin, you've got all these, you've now given this potential hacker all the access that they need to be able to go in and explore the environment further. And what Microsoft did is they came out with something called Privileged Access Manager, and it's a partnership with a product that they already had before, which was called Forefront Identity Manager, and they've rebranded it as just Microsoft Identity Manager in 2016. So by the looks of it, as a systems engineer myself, this is painful, right? Because you've now don't even have to manage one domain. Now you've got a second domain you have to kind of be worried about, because now you've got two domains to manage. And the one thing about this is that there's a one-way forest trust from the privileged domain controller to the production domain controller. So the way this works is essentially you've got two domains. You've got a production domain, you've got a privileged domain, but there's no admin users in the production domain. The way this works is you have something called, you can either use the Microsoft Identity Manager option, or with 2016, they've actually built PowerShell commandlets, which you can use to be able to establish the one-way trust, as well as allow group delegations to the OU from the privileged domain into the production domain. So the way this would work is you have to be very cognizant about how you create these groups, because the groups have to be mirrored from the production side as well as on the privileged side. And each time a user needs to be able to do some sort of admin level work, you have to request access to it. That's one of the pain points, which can be automated, but the beauty of that is these are now time-stamped and time-generated tickets, meaning that if somebody needs elevated permissions to be able to go in and make domain changes, they can request access for an hour, and that's it. You no longer have to worry about who's still stuck in the domain admins group, who's still in the enterprise admins group, and who is no longer in that group. Right. So the way this works is you've got two different domains. You've got the production domain, and then you've got the privileged domain. Now, how do they know, without having to create multiple accounts, you would still use your same account and the same password, but how do they know exactly which, there should be flag permission. So how do they know exactly which groups that user is in, right? You don't have to worry about that in the sense that you're using the same credentials. The difference is something called SID history, and what they do is they pass the same SID ID from the production domain into the admin domain. So when you log in as your privileged account, your SID from the production environment is shared with the user account in the privileged domain, so that when you're making changes, you can use your same credentials and not have to worry about, do I need to manage two accounts? Do I need to manage one account? And it's a very simple PowerShell commandlet to be able to request access from to request access to be able to go into that domain. So when you do get access, this is a heavy lift in terms of the admin who has to create these permissions, right? Because now you have to mirror permissions from both sides. But it is absolutely worth it because you no longer have, so you've got two things. You no longer have any admins in your production domain, and all of your privileged access levels are time-based. So you can set it for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour, whatever it is, fully knowing and being rest assured that once that time is expired, unless they've decided to extend it, which also has the number of limits you can do, which you can also set the number of times that the time can be extended, those users are no longer going to just sit there in that admin group and potentially have the opportunity to be compromised when an attacker or somebody with a weak password is able to get in and access your resources. So what does this look like when you log on to a system? So you've got your privileged domain, and this is your privileged account right here. So when you do Who Am I, even though you're in the privileged domain and you're logged in with your privileged account, you still have once your approval is granted for permission, for domain admin permissions, that domain admin SID is still listed under your privileged account. So you can go in there and make the changes you need. And when you do a search on the production domain of who's a domain admin, it still only has the domain admin that's built into the environment. There's no other users that are sitting in there that don't need to be in there when they're not doing any work. So it's a pretty neat feature. I like it, and it's great in terms of managing who has permissions that they need and what they don't need. What is the issue is it can be very cumbersome to set it up, but it is absolutely worth it. If you this is the PowerShell way of doing it, but there is another way where if you incorporate the Microsoft Identity Manager platform, you can have a web-based GUI, and you can have users go in there and request access specifically for them. It'll automatically generate the tickets, the time-generated tickets from them from the Kerberos, as well as grant them access, and it's a painless process. Otherwise, you have to go in there, run a PowerShell command, and do it that way. And as much as Microsoft is pushing for PowerShell on everybody, there's still resistance to use that as a primary means of administrating your environment. Now, some of you may be wondering, and your inner paranoia kicks in, and you're like, wait, you can just copy the SID from the production domain and grant almost anybody access into the privileged domain and then have them go back in and do stuff. The difference in this situation is that because this only happens because of the trust that's established with the privileged forest. And that's when Microsoft had changed their initial policy. I believe in 2001 there was a SID history injection issue where the domain was originally considered the security boundary, but what users were doing was they were getting the SID from the domain admins group and injecting it into a regular user account. So when they were accessing other domains in that forest, they had domain level access to do anything that they wanted to. But because of the fact that the security boundary here is a force, that PAM trust that happens when you enable the feature protects the production domain from being maliciously hacked. But as Roman was saying this morning, security is a process and people kind of environment, right? You can have all these tools in place, you can do all these things, but if you aren't careful with who's got privileged access in your environment, this will be as useless as anything else you do. This is as good as making everybody an enterprise admin if you don't set the permissions right from the beginning. Does anybody have any questions? Yep. I did, and I borked that environment, but what I can do is I can put a link up either on the B-Side site or somewhere that's accessible, or I can get your contact info after and send you a link to how we can set this up both using MIM, the Microsoft Identity Manager, or using just PowerShell commandlets to be able to set up the environment, as well as how a user can go in and provision their access for whatever admin level tasks that they need. So it depends on how much you want to harden it, right? You can set different permissions, such as who has logon rights to it. You can set who has what network it's in and who can access that network. So it all depends on, again, the systems administrator and how hard they want to make it for that environment to be accessible. Again, it's a people thing where the admin takes on most of the responsibility of configuring it right the first time, rather than waiting for a breach and then realizing that these are some of the settings that you have to have in place. One of the key things about setting up a PAM environment is you have to absolutely harden the host. You have to specify what host can access that server. You also have to specify what users have to specify. what users can access that environment. You can set up authentication policy silos. That's a different talk, but there are ways that one of the key things about being able to have this be successfully run in your environment is you have to harden up different layers up to getting to the PAM server, as well as requesting access to be able to make the admin level changes in the environment. Correct. Yeah. 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 And you are going to have that in some of the environments, right? Where you have to kind of skirt that line about maintaining the legacy applications that aren't moved over yet, as well as who even needs to be able to request access. So it's always that fine line of how you want to set it up and who you want to restrict. Yeah. Right. So in that scheme of things, when you use PIM, or even when you use a PowerShell commandlet, you can specify what groups can access that. So with Microsoft Identity Manager, they make it easy in the sense that there's a web URL that the user can connect to, but that you don't need to be you don't need to access that from a specific host, because you can set the permissions based off of the user group. So you can specify what groups or what users can access that URL, and you don't need Bob in the middle so that Alice can go ahead and grant access to the HR database. She can do it on her own, as long as the PAM admin makes sure that she has access to be able to get to that URL or be able to run that PowerShell script. Yeah. Yep. So you can set it to different time limits. You can set it to expire every 90 days, and it'll automatically check in with the Active Directory and set a new password for it for the next 90 days. Or you can set it, if you don't set any values for when you want the password to expire, it'll just be a default never expire account. Right, but then you don't want that to be, ideally you want it to expire every 90 days, but you don't want it to be, when you set it to never expire, right, you still had to keep a track of that. You still had to know, and someone still had access to the account password. So with managed service accounts, nobody has access to the actual password. Nobody knows what the password is, and that's where the key to that piece comes in. So yeah, you can set it to never expire, but even when you do that, no one will actually have access. No one will actually know what the password is that was originally set for it, and it'll never break. Like if it ever does break, Active Directory will be responsible for resetting that password if you wanted to. There are certain benchmarks, I believe, that have that requirement where passwords should expire every 90 days or 30 days or whatever it is. So that's where you would typically set the 90-day validity of that password. Otherwise, yeah, just leaving it alone, having it managed by Active Directory is the best way to go. Anyone else? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the biggest advantage is time, right? Like you can set different time limits for based on how long you think the user should take in order to be able to make these changes. And that's one of the key things that PAM is trying to promote. They want to make sure that everything is time-based. They don't want these permanent memberships or having the user interaction in order to be able to add accounts or remove it. With PAM, and especially in conjunction with Microsoft Identity Manager, you as the admin have the ability to set how long users should be able to have access. And once that expiration limit kicks in, that's what you really, that's really the goal that they're driving for with this kind of setup. Yeah. Yeah, there are features in the Microsoft Identity Manager where you can set what the replication policy is. You can also set backups and as well as recovery options, so that if the privileged domain goes down, you have some mechanism of recovery, as well as if it completely goes down, you do have the ability of going back to the method of making like a local, like a domain admin on the production domain for a short amount of time if you have to restore that connection again, if it's completely borked and there's no way around recovering it or restoring it because of the fact that you've got the different membership groups and everything else. So yeah, there are built-in features with the Microsoft Identity Manager that you don't necessarily get with the PowerShell commandlets unless you specify it very, very explicitly. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone, and I appreciate all the questions.